Welcome my channel. Tonight's story is one of the darkest chapters buried in Louisiana's plantation history, a preacher slave burned alive, and the terrifying chain of events that followed, leaving an entire plantation silent. This is not a legend passed down for shock value. It's a story reconstructed from court records, plantation notes, and forgotten eyewitness accounts that took serious time and effort to uncover. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? And if you value deeply researched, true historical stories that were meant to stay hidden, make sure you subscribe, because uncovering real data like this takes countless hours of digging through history most people never touch. Before the fire, before the accusation, and long before the plantation fell into silence, the preacher-slave was already a problem. Not because he carried weapons or planned rebellion, but because he carried words. His name was never written cleanly in records. Sometimes he appeared as Isaac, other times simply the preacher. What mattered was not his name, but his voice. On a plantation where silence was enforced as tightly as chains, he spoke with calm authority, and people listened. He was not formally educated, yet he could recite scripture with eerie precision. Passages about judgment, deliverance, and divine justice flowed from his mouth, as if he had lived inside the Bible all his life. Plantation owners tolerated prayer among the enslaved only when it encouraged obedience. Isaac's sermons did the opposite. He never called for violence, never spoke of uprising, and that was exactly what made him dangerous. He spoke of equality before God, of souls weighed the same in death, of masters who would one day kneel alongside slaves with no titles left to protect them. At night, far from the big house, people gathered quietly. No hymns loud enough to carry, no raised voices. Just Isaac, standing barefoot on packed dirt, speaking softly while others leaned in. He spoke of pharaohs who believed themselves untouchable, until the sea swallowed them. He spoke of fire that cleanses lies, and silence that follows cruelty. Those who heard him said his words didn't stir anger, they stirred certainty. And certainty is more frightening to power than rage. Words spread faster than anyone expected. Enslaved workers from neighboring fields found excuses to pass by. Even house servants slipped out to listen. Overseers noticed changes. People walked straighter, eyes lifted. Fear did not vanish, but it shifted. It no longer pointed inward. That alone was enough to alarm the plantation owner. What truly unsettled the masters was that Isaac never denied his role. When questioned, he did not beg or lie. He said he preached because God demanded truth, not permission. One overseer later claimed Isaac looked him directly in the eye and said, "You can bind a man's body, but not the meaning of his breath." That sentence traveled through the plantation faster than any sermon. To the enslaved, Isaac became more than a preacher. He became proof that dignity could survive captivity. Mothers brought their children to hear him. Elderly men who had not spoken in years nodded quietly when he spoke. Even those who feared punishment admitted something felt different when he prayed, as if the night itself leaned closer. To the plantation owners, however, Isaac was a crack in the wall. His influence threatened order without ever breaking a rule outright. That made him difficult to punish. He didn't organize meetings openly. He didn't carry messages. He didn't resist physically. All he did was speak, and the results terrified them. Productivity dropped. Overseers reported defiance of spirit. That phrase appeared in plantation notes, circled twice. Then came the rumors. Masters claimed Isaac was practicing forbidden rituals, that he was mixing scripture with something darker, that people left his gatherings shaken, crying, or silent for days. None of this was proven, but fear doesn't need proof, it needs permission. And once fear took hold among the owners, it fed on itself. What finally sealed Isaac's fate was not rebellion, but reverence. An overseer reported seeing a group of enslaved men step aside to let Isaac pass, lowering their heads in respect. That single act, not ordered, not forced, was unforgivable. Respect was meant to flow only one way. From that moment on, Isaac was no longer seen as a preacher. He was labeled a threat. His words were reinterpreted as poison. His calm was rebranded as manipulation. The plantation owner reportedly said, "If he can command silence without shouting, imagine what he could do if he ever chose to." That fear transformed into a plan, not to punish him quietly, but to make an example so absolute that no one would ever listen again. The goal was not just to kill the man, it was to burn the influence out of memory. What they failed to understand was this: Isaac's power was never in his body. It was in what he had already planted. Long before the fire was built, his words had taken root, and words, once released, do not die with the speaker. They wait. The accusation that sealed Isaac's fate was as sudden as it was brutal, yet in many ways, it had been building quietly for months. On a plantation governed by fear and the strictest hierarchy, any deviation from the expected order was magnified, twisted, and weaponized. Isaac had spent years walking a fine line, preaching quietly, offering solace and guidance to the enslaved, and avoiding overt confrontation with the overseers. But to the masters, his calm confidence, the way men and women leaned in when he spoke, the way even the youngest children repeated his words, became intolerable. It began with a small incident in the cotton fields. A group of field hands had been caught talking about the sermons Isaac had delivered the previous night. Their voices were hushed, almost reverent, yet the overseer overheard them laughing quietly at one of Isaac's analogies about justice and divine judgment. Laughter, even in secrecy, was dangerous. It was interpreted as mockery of the master's authority. That single observation was reported to the plantation owner, who demanded an investigation. The investigation was perfunctory at best. Overseers and house servants were questioned, and everyone knew what was expected: implicate Isaac in wrongdoing. No evidence was necessary because the charge itself was rooted in fear. The claim that finally became the official accusation was that Isaac had spread sedition among the enslaved and incited rebellion through words and prayer. There was no proof beyond whispered testimony and circumstantial observations. But on this plantation, the weight of suspicion was enough to decide life or death. Isaac himself did not deny the accusation. He understood the danger, but his conscience would not allow him to lie. When confronted by the master, he calmly explained that he spoke only of God's truth and sought to comfort the people. "I speak of souls, not of revolt," he told them. The master rules the body. God rules the spirit. His answer did nothing to appease the masters. If anything, it intensified their fear. To them, obedience had limits, and Isaac's spiritual defiance had crossed them. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed Isaac had cursed the plantation, that misfortunes were the direct result of his influence. A horse had died inexplicably in the field. A baby had fallen ill and recovered only after Isaac prayed over him. while another worker had inexplicably succumbed to disease shortly after. These stories, true or exaggerated, were enough to confirm the worst fears of the masters. The tension reached a breaking point during a particularly humid summer evening. Isaac had gathered a small group to pray in the quarters after work. An overseer reported seeing him lay his hands on a sick child and proclaim blessings that seemed almost magical. By the next day, word reached the master that Isaac was bewitching the enslaved, binding them with his voice and his hands. The accusation was formalized. He was to be punished severely. What made this accusation especially dangerous was how public it became. Instead of a private reprimand, the plantation owner decided to make an example. He ordered that the entire plantation be assembled, so that everyone could witness the consequences of defiance. A warning to all. The accusation, once whispered and then confirmed, became the justification for one of the most horrifying acts the plantation had ever seen. Even the enslaved were horrified, though secretly, many were not surprised. They had seen the fear in the master's eyes whenever Isaac spoke. The way his words made the air feel heavier, charged with some unseen power. They knew that the accusation would lead to violence. They only hoped that somehow their preacher's spirit might survive. The process of accusation was swift. Overseers were instructed to gather testimony, which was often little more than personal opinion or hearsay. House servants were coerced to give statements condemning him. Every piece of evidence was designed to make the decision seem justified, even moral. By the end of the day, the verdict was clear: Isaac was guilty, and the punishment would be absolute. In the minds of the masters, the accusation was more than a legal formality. It was the final step in restoring their control. Words could be dangerous, but fire, they believed, would be definitive. Isaac's fate was sealed not by law, not by crime, but by fear, superstition, and the realization that one man's influence could unsettle a whole plantation. And once the fire was lit, what followed would leave everyone on the plantation in stunned silence, a grim reminder that some voices are impossible to silence completely. The act of burning Isaac alive was not a spontaneous decision. It was calculated to make the strongest impression possible, a spectacle meant to instill terror and reinforce control over the enslaved population. On a humid Louisiana afternoon, the plantation was eerily quiet, as if the land itself knew what was about to unfold. Overseers had cleared the fields, forcing everyone to assemble in the central yard, a place where the master's authority could be displayed to the largest audience. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, and men and women shifted nervously, aware that the preacher they respected and feared was about to be executed in a way that none of them could forget. Isaac was brought forward, calm and composed despite the chains that bound him. His presence alone seemed to command the air. He didn't struggle, didn't cry, and didn't beg. Instead, he scanned the crowd, his gaze meeting those of the young ones, the elders, even the overseers. There was something in his eyes that made hearts pause, a quiet knowledge that he was facing more than death. He was facing the attempt to erase him from memory entirely. The pyre was prepared in the center of the yard, a stack of timber soaked in pitch and oil to ensure the fire would be both intense and slow. The overseers and plantation owner discussed details with grim faces, treating the act as a necessary ritual to restore order. When Isaac was placed atop the woodpile, there was a moment of unnatural stillness. The birds had stopped singing. The wind died. Even the heat of the sun seemed to hesitate, as if the day itself was watching. When the flames were finally lit, the fire roared immediately, sending thick black smoke curling toward the sky. Isaac's body was consumed rapidly, yet his face remained eerily visible through the flickering embers for a brief, terrifying instant. Witnesses would later recall that there was no scream, no panic, only a calm expression, as though he were silently speaking to the people assembled, reminding them of something they could not see or understand. The smell of burning pitch mixed with human flesh hung heavily in the air, and those who inhaled it found themselves coughing violently, their stomachs turning. It was a sensory horror, designed to leave no room for doubt. The preacher had been punished, and the power he wielded was supposedly gone. But what followed was not the obedience the masters expected. From the moment the fire consumed him, strange occurrences began. Some witnesses swore that the smoke itself seemed unnatural, twisting and turning in patterns that resembled a human form. Whispers, faint but unmistakable, were heard rising from the flames, words that no one could understand, yet carried the unmistakable cadence of speech. Even the most hardened overseers claimed to feel a weight pressing on their chests, as if the earth itself were resisting what they had done. Those in the yard noticed animals behaving oddly. Horses neighed and reared, dogs barked frantically, and even the chickens scattered in panic. A wind picked up suddenly, carrying ash and embers across the plantation, landing on the overseer's clothing and burning them slightly. Panic began to spread, though no one dared speak aloud for fear of authority. It was as though the act that was meant to reinforce power instead disrupted it completely. As the fire died down, the crowd remained frozen in place. Isaac's body had turned to ash, yet some claimed to see faint shapes moving in the smoke, a shimmer that suggested he had not left at all. Others reported hearing the faint sound of a child's cry or whispers of sermons carried on the wind. The horror was compounded by the realization that his death had not restored control, but had instead left a lingering presence that none of them could explain. The burning was intended as a definitive punishment, but it became a turning point. Where fear had once been controlled and structured, it now became chaotic and unpredictable. Those who had witnessed the execution carried the memory of his calmness and the strange occurrences into their daily lives. Plantation hands began to whisper in corners, eyes darting toward the yard, and even the masters reported unease. The authority that had seemed absolute before Isaac's death now felt fragile, as if the very act of burning him had opened something that could not be contained. That single public execution, meant to silence a voice, ended up amplifying it in the memories and imaginations of all who were present. The plantation itself seemed to mourn, fields lying fallow, animals refusing to graze nearby, and a heavy stillness settling over the land. What was intended as a warning instead became a mark, a reminder that some lives, some voices, and some spirits cannot be destroyed by fire alone. The pyre had consumed his body, but not the presence he carried, nor the fear, awe, and reverence that would continue to haunt the plantation long after the flames had died. Even decades later, people who passed near the old plantation swore they could feel a presence lingering in the fields where the fire had been lit. Shadows moved unnaturally, whispers echoed without a source, and the memory of the preacher's calm endurance during the burning persisted as a story that silenced conversation even among those who did not believe in ghosts. The execution was meant to end Isaac's influence, but in truth, it had only ensured that his legacy, and the terror surrounding it, would endure forever. The immediate aftermath of Isaac's execution was nothing like the plantation owners had anticipated. They had expected fear, obedience, and quiet compliance. Instead, the moment the flames died and the ashes cooled, a pervasive and unnatural silence settled over the plantation. It wasn't just the absence of sound from the enslaved people. They were frozen, eyes wide, shoulders stiff. But the air itself seemed heavy, oppressive, as if the land had absorbed the horror of what had been done and was now holding its breath. The fields that had once been alive with the rhythm of labor seemed muted. Even the animals avoided the area where Isaac had been burned, as though they too recognized that something unexplainable had occurred. The enslaved workers who had been forced to watch were shaken to the core. Many could not speak, while others whispered cautiously among themselves, careful not to draw the attention of the overseers. But even in whispers, a subtle tension began to grow. People had seen Isaac die, yet there was something in the way the smoke had twisted around the crowd. The way embers seemed to linger unnaturally in the air, that made it feel as though he had not entirely left. Some claimed to hear the faint echo of his voice in the wind, calling out prayers, reciting scripture, or repeating phrases that had once brought comfort, now transformed into warnings. The plantation owners, too, felt the unsettling weight of the event. They had thought the act of burning him would restore absolute control, yet in the days that followed, inexplicable occurrences began to unsettle even the masters. Tools went missing, livestock disappeared, and at night, the sound of a child crying could be heard drifting across the fields. A cry no one could locate, but everyone recognized as eerily similar to Isaac's. These disturbances spread unease, eroding the sense of security that had been carefully cultivated over years of brutal rule. Visitors to the plantation soon noticed a strange atmosphere. Neighbors who came to check on the aftermath of the fire described a suffocating heaviness in the air, an almost tangible presence that made them turn back before reaching the house. Even birds and insects seemed to avoid the area. The usual buzz of cicadas and hum of bees was replaced by an oppressive stillness. It became clear that this was no ordinary fear. Something about Isaac's death had left a residue, a mark on the land itself that no rational explanation could touch. Within weeks, minor incidents escalated into truly disturbing events. Overseers reported that small fires would ignite in storage rooms, crops would fail unexpectedly, and livestock would fall ill or die without reason. Enslaved workers whispered that these events were Isaac's doing, that the preacher, even in death, was exacting some form of justice or warning from beyond. They did not speak this openly, but their eyes conveyed the same message. The fire had not ended him. It had only awakened something that could not be controlled. The most striking element of the aftermath was the shift in behavior among the enslaved people themselves. Prior to the execution, fear of punishment had dictated every movement. Afterward, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible change. Workers no longer moved with the same robotic obedience. Eyes would meet across the fields, a shared understanding passing silently between them. There was a quiet resilience, a recognition that some power, some truth, had survived Isaac's death. The masters interpreted this as defiance, though they could not pinpoint how or why it had begun. Even the house servants, those closest to the plantation family, reported strange experiences. Doors that had been locked were found open, footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and a faint, persistent smell of smoke lingered, even in rooms far from the site of the fire. Some claimed to see shadows moving independently of the people casting them, always near where Isaac had been executed. It was as if his presence had not left with the flames, but had instead embedded itself into the fabric of the plantation. Over the next months, the community of enslaved workers and the overseers alike grew quieter, more cautious. Conversations died quickly when someone approached, and no one stayed out in the fields after dark unless absolutely necessary. A sense of shared fear spread, not just of punishment, but of the unknown consequences of what had been done. The fire had been meant to erase Isaac, but instead, it had created an invisible authority that transcended the master's power, a reminder that some forms of influence cannot be destroyed by violence alone. By the end of that season, the plantation was marked not only by tragedy, but by tension and superstition. No one could deny the strange events following Isaac's death. The once clear hierarchy of power had shifted, subtly but permanently. The field hands no longer whispered openly about their faith, yet their quiet gatherings continued. Those who had seen or felt the strange disturbances never fully recovered from the sense that Isaac's spirit, or the force of his words, lingered. The plantation had been silenced in more ways than one by fear, by awe, and by something that defied explanation. The immediate aftermath of the execution proved that control through terror has limits. While the fire had consumed a body, it had not consumed the influence of a man whose life had been defined by the words he spoke and the faith he carried. And in the quiet, heavy air of the plantation after the flames died, every person present understood, whether they admitted it or not, that some power could not be burned away, and some cries echo far beyond the reach of mortal hands. The strange deaths and unexplained disturbances that followed Isaac's execution were the beginning of a pattern that no one on the plantation could ignore. What was meant to be a warning, a demonstration of absolute authority, instead became a source of terror. Almost immediately after the fire, the overseers began reporting events that defied reason. Tools and equipment went missing, not randomly, but in a way that suggested deliberate action by an unseen hand. Horses refused to enter certain fields, breaking into panicked runs when driven near the area where Isaac had been burned. Dogs barked relentlessly at empty corners of the yard, and even chickens scattered wildly, their cries echoing unnervingly through the night. The first human death following Isaac's execution occurred within days. A young field hand, previously healthy and strong, collapsed while tending the cotton rows. There was no sign of injury, no illness diagnosed, but by evening, he was dead. Those who found him whispered nervously, recalling Isaac's final sermons and wondering if some unfinished power had been released upon the plantation. The incident terrified both enslaved workers and overseers, and conversations about Isaac quickly turned from fear to superstition. More deaths followed. A house servant, tasked with caring for the family, was found dead in the kitchen, his body unnaturally still, his face frozen in terror. The animals on the plantation began to die in unusual numbers. Horses fell in the stables, goats were discovered lifeless in their pens, and poultry dropped as though struck by invisible hands. Even the land seemed to rebel. Crops in the fields failed unexpectedly, wilted overnight, or rotted in the sun without explanation. Every misfortune was attributed to Isaac's lingering presence, and the sense of dread became pervasive. It wasn't just death that haunted the plantation. The living were affected as well. People reported hearing faint cries in the distance, the unmistakable wail of a child that seemed to drift from nowhere. Shadows moved where no light fell. Doors that had been locked opened on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoed through empty hallways. Many of the enslaved workers claimed they had seen a small figure in the corners of their vision, standing silently, observing them. Even those who had doubted the stories found themselves uneasy, sensing something unseen watching them constantly. The plantation owner tried to dismiss these occurrences as coincidence, insisting that superstition was poisoning the minds of his workers. But when his own family began to experience misfortune, livestock dying, servants falling ill, and strange sounds at night, he could no longer deny the pattern. The deaths and disturbances were no longer confined to the enslaved population. They had begun to touch everyone on the plantation. Fear of Isaac's influence became an equalizer, sparing no one, regardless of status or power. Perhaps most chilling were the stories of how Isaac's voice seemed to linger. Workers claimed that on quiet nights, they could hear faint whispers reciting scripture, murmurs of judgment, and prayers drifting across the fields where he had been burned. Some even swore that the fire itself seemed to burn differently after his death, embers moving in unnatural patterns, shadows forming shapes that resembled a child, and a faint, acrid smell that lingered long after the flames had gone cold. The plantation felt alive in a way that no one could explain, as if Isaac's presence had infused the very land. The psychological impact on the people was profound. Enslaved workers grew hesitant to speak openly, afraid of provoking some unseen force. Overseers became jumpy, second-guessing themselves, hesitant to give orders. Even the plantation owner, once confident in his authority, began sleeping with the windows locked and doors bolted, convinced that some force beyond human understanding had been unleashed. The sense of unease was so intense that many families began leaving the plantation when possible, fearing that lingering too long would bring them harm. Rumors began to spread beyond the plantation itself. Neighbors and traveling traders reported strange occurrences when passing near the property. Lights flickering at night, cries echoing across the fields, and glimpses of a small figure moving in the fog. The story of Isaac's execution and the horrors that followed became a cautionary tale whispered across the region, reinforcing the notion that his death had not ended his influence. It had only amplified it. In time, the plantation itself became a place people avoided. Fields lay fallow, the house slowly fell into disrepair, and livestock were no longer raised there in quantity. Everyone who had lived through the events knew the truth. The fire had not silenced Isaac, nor had it erased the consequences of what had been done. Instead, it marked the beginning of a period of fear, death, and unexplained occurrences that would haunt the land for generations. The deaths and disturbances following Isaac's execution were not random accidents. They were a warning, a reminder, and perhaps a manifestation of something that no human power could control. The plantation was never the same again, and the story of what followed would be passed down in hushed tones, a chilling testament to the idea that some lives and some voices cannot be extinguished, not even by fire. The final event that left the plantation abandoned and silent was the culmination of months of fear, death, and unexplainable occurrences that no one, not even the masters, could control. After Isaac's execution, the plantation had been a place of unease, where shadows moved on their own, livestock died mysteriously, and the cries of a child, or something that sounded like a child, echoed through the fields at night. Families on the plantation became increasingly terrified, and the balance of power that the owners had relied upon for decades began to crumble under the weight of events they could not rationalize. The breaking point came one stormy night, a humid evening thick with fog and electricity in the air. The plantation's main house had already begun to show signs of neglect, but the family insisted on staying, determined to maintain control despite everything. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, a fire broke out in the storage room near the old fields. At first, it seemed accidental, perhaps lightning or an overturned lantern, but the fire spread with an unnatural speed, devouring the barn, the stables, and creeping toward the main house. Everyone scrambled to save what they could, but the flames seemed to move in deliberate paths, avoiding some areas while consuming others with terrifying precision. Witnesses later claimed they saw shadows flicker within the flames, small human forms that darted from corner to corner, as if the fire itself had a mind. When dawn came, the plantation was half destroyed. Livestock were gone, either dead or scattered into the swamps. The fields were ruined. The crops burned or trampled in the chaos. The family's sense of authority had been completely shattered. Even the overseers, who had enforced brutality without hesitation in the past, refused to continue working there. They whispered of the preacher, of his calm defiance at the pyre, and of the events that had followed, how death and destruction seemed to follow his absence like a shadow. No one wanted to stay. Every living person left the plantation as quickly as they could, abandoning not only the land, but the very notion that human control could ever return. The abandoned plantation quickly became a place of stories and superstitions. Locals passing nearby swore they could see lights flickering in the ruins at night, or hear faint crying from the fields where the pyre had once stood. Some reported seeing a small figure wandering among the ashes, barefoot and calm, as if walking on the very memories of those long gone. Travelers were warned to stay far away, especially at dusk, because those who ignored the warnings often returned shaken, pale, or with stories they could barely speak aloud. Over time, the plantation was swallowed by the wilderness. Trees and undergrowth overtook the paths and buildings, erasing the familiar landmarks. But the land itself seemed unwilling to forget. Hunters and explorers would sometimes stumble upon areas where animals refused to go, where the soil seemed unnaturally soft, or where the air was heavy and still, as if the ground itself remembered the horror that had occurred. Every ruin, every scorched field, became a silent witness to the events surrounding Isaac's death. The families who once lived there never returned. Letters from neighboring plantations spoke of their relocation and the fear that had driven them away, describing the estate as cursed or haunted, though no rational explanation could satisfy their neighbors. Even decades later, descendants of the plantation workers warned their children to stay clear of the old fields, teaching the story of the preacher and the fire as both a cautionary tale and a truth that could not be ignored. What made this final event so terrifying wasn't simply the fire or the destruction. It was the total, inescapable sense that the plantation itself had become a vessel for the preacher's lingering presence. The attempt to control, punish, and erase him had failed utterly, and the consequences extended beyond Isaac's death to touch every person who remained. Silence, in this case, was not peace. It was fear, awe, and resignation. The land itself seemed to demand respect, its quiet a warning to any who might attempt to assert dominion over what had already been marked by forces beyond human comprehension. By the time the plantation was left completely abandoned, the legend of Isaac and the horrors that followed had taken hold in the surrounding community. People spoke of the place only in whispers, telling stories of cries in the night, strange fires, and figures glimpsed in the fog. The abandoned plantation became a symbol, a chilling reminder that some acts, some lives, and some powers cannot be silenced by violence. The preacher's execution had been intended to restore order, but instead it left a legacy far more powerful than anyone could have anticipated. Even today, historians and locals agree on one thing: the Louisiana plantation was never truly silent after that night. Its fields, ruins, and forested edges carry the memory of the preacher, the fire, and the consequences that no one could stop. The land stands as a permanent witness to the terrifying lesson that some voices, and the forces they awaken, cannot be burned, buried, or forgotten.